if you're wondering, that's one of the most divisive videos we've ever done, I think. Some people told us they cried last week when they watched it, and some told us they got a migraine. So the context there is, that's a tree that sits right at the top of Ascension, not at the very top of Ascension, but before you go down onto Entertainment. And we thought Leah, just her style lended itself to this like super abstract and yet something clear, which is this conversation that we're in. Also kind of turns out it's the world that we're living in. So I'd like to start by praying, and then we're going to dive in. God, another week, another set of circumstances that could obliterate relationship and drive us into kind of a populism that I don't think anybody would win from. And so, God, I pray that you would continue to lead, and thank you so much for that song that Tommy brought, and just this incredible reminder, God, that at the end of the day, this place, and for many of us, our very lives are staked to the idea that you sit on the throne and you're in charge, and that we carry a responsibility to lead as you would. So pray for our leaders, both locally and at the state level and at the national level, that you would lead in and through them, at times in spite of them, and sometimes even with them. We love you, God. Amen. So, you ever had a friend who got into some kind of pyramid scheme, and next thing you know, you couldn't hang out with them anymore? You know that thing? I remember years ago, there was a travel agency one that went around, like some kind of travel one, and my friend Brian was leading a church in Bozeman at the time, and I was going to grad school with him, and he was telling me how it was this nightmare because suddenly, they had ushers and greeters and things, like talking to people who were attending church for the first time about their pyramid scheme. So if you know that feeling, because it's never a pyramid scheme, right? It's not a pyramid scheme. That's kind of the way I feel this morning, because there's something that I was introduced to way back in 2017 called centering prayer, and I've talked about it off and on, but I would be lying if I didn't say that it's been pretty instrumental in my faith journey. And I'll give a little bit more context a little bit later, but I took this class where I was assigned to practice centering prayer 20 minutes a day for 5 days a week. And the class started in late August. It was a 2-semester class from Dr. Bruner. Many of you know Dr. Bruner. And it ended in early May. So it was quite a long run. And I actually talked to Dr. Bruner about that recently, and he said, Adam, the way I understand the project is I'm going to make it an assignment for students to practice centering prayer for whatever that is, 8 or 9 months. And then they get to decide whether or not they're going to spend the next 10 years deciding whether or not it brings value to their life. So my experience with centering prayer was, it started there. I almost made it 3 years, and then this last late February, I quit. And I think that had something to do with, I had my own bout of anxiety late last February, and so I think I was disillusioned, because I thought that this would kind of finally and fully solve that problem, so I walked away from it. And then it was when COVID started, and we started as a staff. I'm so proud of the staff and the way that they stay engaged and really bought into this idea, we're going to try to spend even more time with people and make ourselves more available, whether that's a phone call or a walk or whatever. And I returned to my roots of walking with people. That's what I learned to do in Billings. That's what all my meetings with Fred were. I just thoroughly enjoyed it. And so that's what I started doing in mid-March. And as I was walking with people, and I hope this doesn't objectify you, because many of you were friends that I got to walk with and talk on the phone with and things. I started, it was in March, as I was listening and watching, that I realized that there's something that centering prayer started to teach me that I still wasn't good at, but I was watching these people, many of you among them that I love, struggling with this very thing, so that it was in mid-March I picked it back up. And frankly, it's proven to be incredibly valuable. So that's what I want to talk about this morning. So I'm going to make you a deal. My friend Fred is the greatest personal evangelist I ever have known, and he's constantly talking about people that he's getting to introduce to Jesus. And to be honest with you, I'm a terrible personal evangelist. In fact, it kind of creeps me out. And not that I don't think it's valuable, but I just don't understand how you don't objectify a relationship. And so I asked him years ago, how do you do that? And one of the things he said, Adam, sometimes I'll just get to know somebody, not for the purpose of sharing Christ with them, but just because of life. And sometimes if I get to this point where I love them to such an extent, I'll just say, hey, there's this thing in my life that's really important. Could I have 20 minutes to talk about it? And then if you don't ever want to hear about it again, I'll never bring it up again. I just thought that was brilliant. So that's kind of the deal I want to make you this morning. I'm kind of selling a pyramid scheme, kind of not, but so to speak. I've kind of marked this weekend as this chance to talk about this practice that's very foreign, very weird, especially to our Western Christian ears. And if at the end of this morning you decide you want to go for a walk or be in a group and practice this together or read Cynthia Bourgeau's book, which is exceptional, or you don't ever want to hear it again, that'll all be up to you. Deal? That's kind of the pitch. And then what we're going to do is on the back end, Hannah, incidentally, is in that class that I took, that I started in 2017. So I swooped into her office early this week, and I was like, hey, what if we brought you up on the stage, because you're like 4 months into it, and let them ask you some questions about whether or not you've lost your soul through the practice of practicing centering prayer. So that's what we're going to do this morning, which also means this. If you came to church this morning reluctantly, or you're watching reluctantly, or you're listening reluctantly, but like she's cute or he's cute or whatever the situation is, you get to watch the football game if you come, and your conviction was Christians are weirdos, like I'm going to help you write the paper this morning. Like you could add to your dissertation because of this morning. But it also means this: if you came this morning skeptical or even cynical towards places like this and people like me and their ability to really bring about real transformation of who you are at your deepest level, I think this morning's also for you. Conversely, if you're someone who watches me and watches Narrate, I just had another meeting on Friday where it's always interesting when I hear from people who are part of this place tell me what people from other churches tell me is true of us. It's just very fascinating, somewhat scary, somewhat entertaining. It's especially when they're playing voice recordings from you from like 2014. But if you came this morning wondering whether or not we were even Christian or I was even Christian or whether or not this is still your place because maybe I'm not following historical orthodoxy, I actually want to push you a little this morning. Because on one hand, I'm going to confirm your bias because we're not going to talk lots about Western tradition, though I absolutely value this, the Bible, Bible study, books, all of it. But we are going to talk about some things that go way back, things that are as simple as solitude and silence, but often take on different titles. So it's kind of going to be a messy bag for you too. And lastly, I think that means that if you're someone here that there's this internal shame, that you live with this sense of everybody here's the real deal, but I'm not, and if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me, and you definitely wouldn't sign off on my Christianity, I think this morning's for you as well. Because the question that we're asking and that I really want to get at is, like, how do we become the kinds of people who respond to life real time the way it seems Jesus so often did? One of the most powerful stories, for me in the Gospels is that time where Jesus, I always just picture him rolling over the top of a hill, and I don't even know if that's where they were walking, but he rolls into town. And I always have to remind myself, population was smaller. It wasn't tens of thousands. It was dozens or hundreds of people. But he rolls into town, and people are expecting him, and there's people lining the streets, which is, I'm told, more common in this culture, in this era. And there's one guy who's climbed a tree, a type of tree that in our culture is a house plant, but it's this giant kind of fig tree. And he's looking down at Jesus, and Jesus sees this throng of people. He knows he's hungry. He knows he's got to eat somewhere tonight. And he looks at this guy named Zacchaeus who doesn't pass any kind of religious inspection. And he says to Zacchaeus, well, actually, he starts a musical right there. He writes a musical. You might remember the musical. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. Come down. There's a whole musical that he writes. And eventually, they get done singing and dancing. Anna's going to do that musical this May, maybe at the Grand Street. And he goes to Zacchaeus' house for dinner. And there's this whole exchange that happens at dinner that we're not privy to all the details. At the back end of that exchange, Zacchaeus completely changes his business model, completely commits to a different way of living with people, and in fact commits to like reparations or bringing justice to those that he's wronged. And my question has always been, how did Jesus see Zacchaeus for what he was? Like, maybe it was because he's God, and there's some sense of that where that's probably true to some extent, that he can see hearts. But I'm just constantly going to fight for, but he was also human. So it couldn't have been as simple as like he had the Iron Man mask and it saw through the matrix. Maybe he had met Zacchaeus before. It's real silent on that. But how do we become to the kinds of people who respond to circumstances with that kind of confidence rather than fear, with that kind of trust rather than suspicion? Or the other one that's equally as famous is that moment when Jesus is, I'm not really sure what he was doing at the time, but these religious men bring to him they bring to him a woman that they say has been caught in the act of adultery. And where I think meditation practices like Lectio Divina can be helpful is just to try to feel what that scene must have been like. The disheveled nature of her, the the reality of like what was the look on their faces, were like the pride that they would have drugged this woman, the fact that they brought one part of the relationship to Jesus, not both parts. And Jesus, in this moment where he knew he was trapped, to say kill her, which is what their interpretation of the law would have said, would have been to break the Roman law. And while the Romans gave them lots of governing power, they did not have the power to execute people. So he'd have been in trouble with Rome. But if he says, like, don't kill her, then he's in trouble with the Jewish law, because the Jewish law says kill her. And Jesus, of course, many of you will remember, he just stoops, and there's been 2,000 years of speculation, like, what did he write in the sand? And there's all kinds of speculation around that idea. But eventually he just turned and looked at the woman, and he turned and looked at them and said, whoever's without sin, throw the first stone. And again, we don't know how much time elapses. Eventually he notices they're all gone, and he looks at the woman and he says, does no one condemn you? And she says, no one, sir. And he says, lest we think he's just soft and permissive, he says, then neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. And again, for me, the point of all of this is to become the kinds of people who respond to life real time in those ways. It's part of why I envy watching TV shows like Big Bang Theory or Seinfeld or Friends, or movies, because it would be so nice if everything was scripted for us, right? You'd always say the right thing and respond the right way, unless it was scripted that you didn't, and then you wouldn't. But for me, this is where centering prayer comes in. Paul says it this way in Romans 8. He says, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Richard Rohr argues that word flesh there can, in our culture, be understood as ego. And to the extent that it's true, I think it helps understand what Paul's really contrasting here, is where do we live from? To set the mind on the flesh or the ego is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. There's a question. I mean, chances are you wouldn't be in the room if there wasn't this desire to be a different kind of person and live from a different kind of place. The question becomes how. In Galatians 5, Paul says it this way, live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want. But if you're led by the Spirit, you're not subject to the law. And then I'm going to switch to the Message here, because I thought Eugene Peterson's translation of this was worth just listening to. It's obvious what kind of life develops out of trying to get your own way all the time, repetitive, loveless, cheap sex, a stinking accumulation of mental and emotional garbage, friendless, frenzied, and joyless grabs for happiness, trinket gods, magic show religion, paranoid loneliness, cutthroat competition, all-consuming yet never satisfied want, a brutal temper, an impotence to love or be loved, divided homes and divided lives, small-minded and lopsided pursuits, the vicious habit of depersonalizing everyone into a rival, uncontrolled and uncontrollable addictions, ugly parodies of community. I could go on. But what happens when we live God's way? He brings gifts into our lives much the same way the fruit appears in an orchard. Things like affection for others, exuberance about life, and serenity. We develop a willingness to stick with things, a sense of compassion in the heart, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our own way in life, able to marshal and direct our energies wisely. Like, if but for a moment, right? I think that's why we're here. I think that's why Christianity has 2,000 years of history, is there's a sense that there's something bigger that we get to be an extension of. There's a place to live from different than our own. Thomas Keating, who again is one of those lightning rod characters, Google him and you'll find all kinds of positive and negative. He's, as far as I know, he gets credit for the title centering prayer. And the history behind that was in the 60s, he was a monk, a friar, whatever. He hung out with Robin Hood at come on, that was good. It was in Massachusetts, and In the 60s, of course, we all know what the 60s were like, or at least some of you lived them, others of us read about them in history books. But there became this trend where these 20-something people were coming to the door of this monastery that he was at, and they were asking for directions to another monastery that was close by that he was aware of. It was a Buddhist monastery. And after a few interactions like that, he started to get more and more curious, and so he started asking these people showing up at the door for directions pre-Google why they were looking for that and what their religious background was. And what he noted was this theme that these were kids who had been raised in churches. These were people who had been raised in Lutheran or Catholic or Protestant, other types of Protestant churches of some sort. And then he started realizing that what the theme that he heard was that they were looking for the path. We're looking for the path, man, is the way he tells the story. And what he realized in that moment was that, like, Christianity has a path not too dissimilar from the one they're looking for. That Christianity's not all cerebral. It's not all this kind of mental thing where you be transformed by the renewing of your mind by learning stuff and memorizing stuff. In fact, he recalled that the majority of the disciples never read. As far as we know, Jesus never wrote a book. That there's this tradition of silence and solitude within Christianity. And so, from my perspective and many others, he didn't invent something called centering prayer, he rebranded it. He didn't call it the First Baptist Church, he called it Narrate, so to speak. He was trying to make things accessible. And that's where centering prayer comes from. And one of his core convictions here, Justin drew this up on a diagram because I spent 20 minutes on the mind map trying to draw circles. And it turns out even on a computer, they can infuriate you in their imperfection. Justin nailed it instantly. But what he notes is that left to ourselves, he calls it an ordinary awareness. I know this. Some of you are like, see, you guys are weirdos. This is atypical for us. But what he's pointing out is that what Paul's saying is there's an invitation to live from a different center. Now, to be honest with you, I've not taken the time to nuance the difference between spiritual and divine. And if you Google this, now, of course, he's got 70 layers. Like, this thing can be bifurcated 1,000 ways. But his basic point is simply this. What if it takes solitude and silence, or let me just make it not so this or that, so black and white. What if solitude and silence can really help us in our desire to be different kinds of people, living connected to a different kind of God, and thus emanating a different kind of value set? Cynthia Bourgeault, who's also an authority on this issue, when I picked up, so in March, when I started rethinking about this, I reread this incredible book, and if you decide you want to read it, I'd love to go for a walk. If you decide you want to read it as a group, I'd love to kind of orchestrate that for you. But she says this: virtually every spiritual tradition that holds a vision of human transformation at its heart also claims that a practice of intentional silence is non-negotiable. Cynically, when I read that in March, I think it was my fourth time through the book, I thought, except for Western evangelicalism. Now that's being a little harsh, and I'll be the first to admit that. But I think especially in our iPhone, instant access, constant everything, maybe we do well to recognize that there's a long history. Jesus frequently withdrawing by himself to pray. The Psalms, like in the secret, in the quiet place. Maybe you're not as screwed up as you think. Maybe solitude and silence is kind of that pyramid scheme. Take this and your joints will never hurt again. I know that's the way I'm pitching it, but that's, in some sense, that's the way I'm experiencing it. So what is silencing prayer? Well, let me, one more thing, say a couple things that centering prayer is not. First of all, in the world of meditation, there's two forms. There's apophatic, starts with an A. Cataphatic, starts with a C. I think, maybe it's a K. Apophatic meditation, to the extent that you're comfortable with it or familiar with it, is probably the kind. Apophatic meditation is, if you know Christian, like Lectio Divina, or verse meditation, or even Eastern Orthodoxy, the idea of meditating on an image. That's apophatic. It's trying to take your senses and really bear down on a single idea, a single truth. That's where the mantra idea comes from. It'd be convenient if that's what centering prayer was, but it's not. Centering prayer is cataphatic. And the reason why it gets so easily and quickly lumped into other kind of traditions that maybe rightly at times and wrongly at others freak us out is that cataphatic meditation is by definition trying to think of nothing. Now, let me nuance that for you, but first let me say one other thing. Here's the other thing centering prayer is it's not about ahas. In fact, the struggle for me is one of the greatest challenges of cataphatic meditation or centering prayer is if you have an aha, if you solve a problem, if you come up with some kind of solution or some kind of answer, there's no permission to write it down. In fact, you surrender that in the same way you surrender everything else. So what is centering prayer? Well, centering prayer in its most rudimentary form, and this is you can try it for a year, and then in 10 years you can decide whether or not it's worth your while. Centering prayer is in its simplest form is this. It's a 20-minute-a-day commitment. So my routine is, I just kind of built this in and lumped it out of my Bible study time, but I try to roll out of bed and I try to not drink any tea before I get started, because then I just start levitating. That would be good. In this case, it's bad. I can't sit still. I try to roll out of bed, sit on my couch in my office, my home office, and in fact, there's a timer. Where did I put my phone? That's kind of awkward. Sorry, Justin, that doesn't help you with video. There's a timer called the Insight Timer. So if you didn't think I was a heretic, this will help. Because there's an app called the Insight Timer, and I already have it preset to 20 minutes, and I just see if you can. I've totally gone off the deep end. So this thing starts a 20-minute session. In fact, at the end of a 20-minute session, it does it again. But the point isn't this. The point is it's 20 minutes, and here's really what you're doing. Is you enter into it with what they call a sacred word, which there's nothing sacred about the word. Some people, you remember Lynn here a couple years ago when she spoke, she uses the word Yahweh. Some people use Abba. There's a guy, Rich Lewis, I put his book on your mind map. If you're really nervous, he's a good one to read because he comes at this from a much more evangelical perspective. He uses an Eastern Orthodox icon of Jesus. Mine, quite frankly, is just breathe. And really what you're trying to do, in fact, I used the word breathe for a year before I realized I forgot the E at the end. For a year I was using breath, but in my head I was using breathe. Because you're just, but here's what you're doing, is there's some of that's just saying, there's a mindfulness practice that has an illustration of this that I think captures it really well. You are to imagine yourself sitting on a park bench next to a busy street, let's say. They often use a busy river, but we don't have rivers with ships that go up and down them around here. And your thoughts are akin to the traffic on the street. And the goal is you center on the word, whatever your word is. But you go into it knowing that that's not possible, that you have a monkey brain, and that what's going to happen is you're going to notice the Cisco truck, and you're going to, akin to a thought, and you're going to follow the truck down the road, and sometimes the bell goes off at the end, and you're like, oh man, I just was thinking about that for the full 20 minutes. Sometimes you catch yourself 5 seconds in, and this is, to me, the awesome thing about this. I think it's Thomas Keating who says, which means the only way to fail is not to show up, because if in 20 minutes you recognize 100 different trucks going up and down the street, and see, here's what you do, is you recognize, oh, I just started thinking about that phone call I need to make, and this is why I just think this is so central to what we're trying to become as Christians. You surrender that back to God. So you just thought of this thing you wanted to buy on Amazon, or this bike you want to go on, or this conflict you're in, any of it, and you just surrender it to God and go back to center, which isn't to say that you're saying, okay, you don't have to be involved in the solution. It's not saying that you're just going to sit on the couch and eat potato chips and let God solve all your problems. It's just practicing that in this span of 20 minutes, what I'm doing is practicing not being in control. In order to build a disposition, build a muscle, just like going to the gym. Ultimately, this does nothing. You're trying to do something that carries and has value in other seasons of life. And so what you're doing is you're practicing surrendering things to God, which obviously on the one hand is this constant reminder that you don't have to be in charge because God is. And that your goal is to live from God's Spirit, not from your ego. You're doing something, here's the way some people say it, is you're doing something for 20 minutes a day so that for the other 23 hours and 40 minutes in the day, you can do it otherwise. In fact, centering prayer, and I'm not going to get into this, is really a setup for welcoming prayer, and welcoming prayer is centering prayer in the moment. It's being able to quickly identify in the moment, here's what's happening, so I'm going to surrender this to God and trust, oh, high anxiety, high fear, high frustration, I see you. That's all centering prayer is trying to identify the things in your life that you don't have control over, or maybe you have some semblance of control, and just in that moment practicing giving control up. And what I observed, and the reason I picked it back up, so the danger here is it took me 2.5 years to realize I had built something, but as I was listening to people deal with COVID, frankly, I became persuaded by the fact, and I think I started from way of a deficit, so some of you are way ahead of me. That's the good news. But I think I started to develop an ability that I often saw lacking in people that I was processing life with, and that was I had some awareness of the idea that sometimes the best thing is surrender. Which doesn't mean that I don't, at the time, have to help solve the problem, it just means at that time I don't have to, rather. I get to be a part of the solution with God, but in this moment, God, I'm just surrendering. I'm just surrendering. I'm just surrendering. Now, is that what Jesus was doing when Luke says that he was frequently withdrawing and praying? There's no way to prove that. But go study Jesus' prayers, or just study his practice, and then look at the Zacchaeuses and the woman at the well and the woman caught in adultery and the fact that he chose Peter and not these other people. And at the very least, you see a guy who clearly had a connection to the Spirit of God. Here would be an example, and I'm hesitant to tell it, but it's the best example I had. I had this thing happen to me a couple months ago. I was watching football. It's a Sunday night, which means we know we weren't watching the Broncos because they barely qualify for TV. So we were watching a football game on a Sunday night. It was probably like 7 o'clock, and I got a text from a friend, and it was a bummer text. It had a little bit of accusation in it, and just a little bit of like, oh crap, here we go. And without thinking about it, only after the fact that I realized this, I just almost instantly went, okay, Lord, I'm just giving that to you. I'm just surrendering that to you. And I forget whether it was twice or 10 times or whatever. Now, 5 years ago, that would have derailed my next couple hours, the rest of my night. I wouldn't have slept. My next morning, it would have been the topic of conversation. I probably would have sent a reply text that I quickly regretted. There's lots of things that would have happened. None of that happened, which isn't to say that I'm still not capable of it. Next morning, it was still nice out. I got to go for this really long bike ride. And again, because of all this was forefront for me, that thought came up 50 times maybe on my bike ride. And old me would have used that bike ride on my day off to solve the problem. And I just 50 times, somewhere in there, Lord, I'm just giving that to you. I'm just giving that to you. And again, I'm not saying that I don't have to reply to it. I'm not saying that I don't have to be a part of the solution. I'm just deciding in this particular moment, God, I'm just going to acknowledge you in this. Tuesday morning, time to go back to work. I get up, I practice centering prayer. It comes up, surrender, surrender, surrender. And then once I leave my morning study time, I put earbuds in, I go to the gym, I go for a run, and I kind of do the opposite at that part of my morning time where I just let my brain go wherever it goes. Sometimes I listen to the podcast, sometimes I don't in terms of like consciously. And I could still take you to the spot on the street in front of the cool house with the metal roof and the brick fence where this came to mind, and no sooner did it come to mind than I instantly had my reply. Like it was this weird, mystical, eerie thing. Instantly I knew, Adam, the phone call that you need to make in 20 minutes just sounds like this. I'm so sorry to hear that you're angry. We've had a long conversation about this. If you want to talk more about it, that's great. But ultimately, I just want to say thank you. Like, thanks for everything you've done for me, my family, Narrate. Thank you. And I get it. This could be abuse of power and me patting myself on the back. It's really not my point. My point is, I look at centering prayer and go, that's the why behind that what. Not that I didn't have to do something at some point, but somehow, and it just created this little sliver in my otherwise oftentimes screwed up dark world and mind of going, wait a minute, what does it look like to align with God and actually not just hold the sign of peace in the world, but actually somehow bring a different way of being into the world? What if silence and solitude, and this is the biggest challenge, and I'll end with this, the deal with centering prayer is it's by definition supposed to be abstract. You're not supposed to be able to point back to it just like I just did, like that's this 3-year exception. It's not about the ahas, it's about trusting that there's a long history of humans being deeply transformed by God by just sitting in silence and solitude with the holiness of God and trusting that God can work on you in ways that maybe aren't even directly conscious to you. there's my spiel. Ultimately, I would say this, what if the gospel's not just an idea? And what if it's not just about a destination when you die, though that seems to be included? And what if we're not to resent times like this that we're living in? In fact, what if these are the opportunity to be a different kind of a person in a different kind of a way, connected to a strength that's not our own, the powerful Spirit of God? And what if Sarah Prayer could help you? So here's my invitation. We're going to do several things. I'm going to bring Hannah up here. We're going to do some Q&A so you can ask her questions. So if you want to pull out your Slido, if you want to be a part of a group that does this, I'm willing to help facilitate something like that. If you want to talk about it individually, there's just kind of this blank slate. The ball's clearly in your court. And next week we'll go back to talking about something more Western. Let me pray. God, Lord, I thank you for the men and women way before me who have pioneered a way of connecting with you in solitude and silence that's got them labeled any number of things, but also that seems to be reconnecting with who you are and what you're about. God, I pray for my friends here that if this is something that you have for them next in their journey, that you'd make that clear to them, and if what's next for them in their journey is to get up in the morning and open their Bible or create a small group, whatever that is, that you'll lead them faithfully. We love you, God. Amen. Hi, Hannah.
Hi.
So stools are over here. So it's going to be a little wonky, but I thought asking Hannah the questions might be helpful because she's the noob.
Right.
So what was your response? I'm going to start and then I'll look at this.
Ooh, I much prefer asking the questions. This is nerve-wracking.
When you were first given the assignment, what was your first, do you remember what you initially thought or felt?
Well, I kind of knew it was coming because you had talked about it when you did the class a few years before, so I kind of knew this was going to be a part of the class. But my thought was, how am I supposed to not think for 20 minutes?
So how's your experience different than, because you're 4 months in now?
So yeah, I'm 4 months in.
So how would you answer you 4 months later?
It's hard. I think I have this memory, the first time I tried it, I sat down in this chair in my living room that I do my quiet time in, and I think I got out of that chair in 20 minutes like 5 times.
Right.
Wrote things down, and it was a nightmare, but.
How do you explain to your husband what you're doing without being a weirdo?
I wait till he goes to work.
Oh, that's funny. Okay.
He knows I do it, and I've done it a few times where he's like making breakfast, and it's hard when someone else is around. You kind of have to do it alone.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just reading here. I'm not filtering. How do you set your intention as prayer to God or acknowledging God's presence as opposed to nothingness, emptiness that you can reach by meditation?
I think because it's still so new to me, I focus on showing up. And I don't really have an intention or something I want to get out of it. I remember we do these groups in class, my triad, and I remember saying, like, the first few weeks I thought, how do I know if I'm doing this right? How do I know if I'm doing this right? Like, what am I doing? And they encouraged me to go, just show up. Like, just show up, just have the 20 minutes, be there, and stay seated.
Do you know yet whether it's a practice that you'll carry for 10 years?
I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough.
I don't know.
Okay, I guess I'm supposed to be asking your questions, not mine. Why is there an angle that would imply this is not a Christian thing?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think, and I think too, in the class, Dr. Bruner talks about when you start to empty your mind, things come up that are very dark, or you start to experience darkness. And I think in Western spirituality, we equate darkness with evil or bad, and it's really just unknown. And so my answer would be, you experience unknown and experience things that maybe you're uncomfortable with, and so maybe that's why there's pushback. I personally didn't experience any pushback, but...
Has your class bought into it? Has there been pushback from your classmates?
Not really, no.
Okay. Yeah.
There's pushback on why can't I listen to music while I'm doing it? Why can't I, why can't I write something down? Kind of.
Right. Yeah.
But.
that makes me think about, like, I'm actually, every once in a while I feel like there's stuff that comes along where if we surrender our control and trust the source, not the outcome. Like I remember when I took it, their classmates were doing all that stuff. Why can't I go for a walk? Why can't I listen to music? Why can't I? And I think what stood out to me was like, ultimately you can, but what's the value of just trusting this dude and this gal, Cynthia Bourgeot, and this stream of people that are decades into this that just tell you not to. Like it's like being handed a book. Sometimes someone will hand me a book, and if it comes in the right way from the right person, quite frankly, there's times where I'm like, I hate this book and I would otherwise never read it, but because of who just handed it to me, I'm going to. So that would be my 2 cents on that is, I think sometimes you just trust the tradition, which I suppose as Protestants we're not very accustomed to.
Right. Well, and I think too, he's only asking you to do it for a year. It's not like you have to do it for the rest of your life. So.
Yeah. Do you talk with God during centering prayer, or is it just being with God?
I focus on God's presence, not talking to, just being with.
So what does that sound like in your head?
So my word is spirit that I kind of just go through when I'm practicing centering prayer.
Do you spell it correctly?
I do. I guess what was the question again?
Sorry, I don't remember. What does it sound like in your head? What does it sound like in your head when you focus on God's presence?
I don't know. There's not really a sound.
So does that words, the surrendering idea hold meaning for you? Mm-hmm. Okay. So are you saying that to yourself?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to. That's kind of how I focus on letting go. I feel like I have to focus on something. And then eventually, I did a few times, I kind of got to this place where it just did feel like God's presence was there. And it was really just this really cool moment and experience, but I'm trying not to think anything, or I'm trying not to, because my mind is so busy usually that I try to just leave it blank, or I'll imagine like the sound of a river or the sound of the ocean or something like a sound rather than words.
You studied psychology in undergrad. So is there any of this connected to the science of the psychology you've studied? How'd that for putting you on the spot and test the veracity of the 20 grand you spent?
Oh my gosh. I think there's something definitely with anxiety and relieving anxiety. And there's something about getting out of your head and your thoughts and being focused on your body and the moment and something bigger than yourself. I would like to research that question, but that's
okay. We'll make this the last one, so band, you guys can make your way. I know we don't write during the solitude, but what do the authors say about journaling after on what we have surrendered? Is that considered a no-no?
I don't think afterwards.
Yeah.
Afterwards is fine. I did try it during, and I would take notes on my phone, but Instagram's also on my phone. So there were a few times where I got distracted. But that's a big no, not during. But afterwards.
Yeah, and I think the caution there would be that to what extent can you take notes afterwards without giving a lot of energy to remembering that note throughout? So I think Bruner's really big about journaling.
Yeah.
You'd have to show up to that without an agenda for capturing what you just did so much as just reflecting on what you just did.
Part of our assignment is, 15 minutes a week, you are writing down kind of your reflections and your thoughts on what's happening or what came up.
Good point. So how has what you thought this practice would be for you, to what degree has it lived up to an expectation? To what degree has it defied an expectation?
Well, that's a lot of question.
Yeah.
When I first knew that this was going to be an assignment, I thought, how am I going to sit for 20 minutes and not do anything? So I just thought it was kind of impossible, really. And it was for several weeks. It takes quite a while it took me quite a while to get to where I could actually spend 20 minutes clearing my mind, doing nothing. So it took a while, and I'm only 4 months in, so I feel like I'm still building that muscle of intentionally practicing this. But I guess I didn't really have any idea of what to expect. I trust Dr. Bruner. I like him, and so I thought I'm going to try this for a year and kind of see what happens.
Yeah, that's a good. I like that. Just that reminder of this, just trusting him. The first question here just deals with like, is there something specific about the 20-minute length? Have you guys talked about that in class?
Gosh, that's a good question. I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't think. I think it's a minimum, not a maximum, is my understanding.
I think so. Yeah.
So, good on you if you make it 2 hours.
Yeah, good on you.
And I mean, again, like if you go read Bourgeois or Keating, all of them are talking about 2 20-minute. Have you done a twice a day thing? Yeah.
No, I had to start and I don't know if Dr. Bruner would approve this, but I had to start with 10 minutes and just go make it 10 minutes and then slowly added up to 20.
So do you find that does the 20 minutes, I mean, you're doing 20 minutes now. Does it feel like an hour or does it feel quick?
It totally depends on the day. Yeah. Sometimes it feels really quick and I use the same timer, and so sometimes it'll go off and I'm like, wait, it's 20 minutes, and then other times I'm like, did I set that? It's so long.
Yeah, I have that exact same experience. Yeah, that sometimes it feels like forever, and one of the things that I think it's Thomas Keating that says as you get deeper into it, you have to learn to differentiate centering prayer or feeding the presence of God versus feeding your introvert. Because I will catch myself sometimes going like, this is awesome, and then going like, I don't think I'm actually doing anything.
This is great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do that too.
Man, that's weird how they move around. So someone was asking about what happens how do you know if you're doing it right? If I tried to think about nothing, I'd either fall asleep or think back to getting cut off in traffic 5 years ago.
That was a big thing for me. So in this class, we have what we call a triad. It's just 3 of us that meet every other week and kind of talk about our experiences. And that was one thing that kept coming up for me. I kept saying, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? I just want to do it perfectly. Where's the checklist that I can, do it perfectly? And they kept reminding me, it's not about doing it perfectly. It's about showing up and giving God 20 minutes. And so, and I don't think of traffic. I think of a stream with kayakers.
You do?
Yeah.
See, I would think about drowning.
Oh my gosh. So I don't know. I think I just kept coming back to there's a lot of grace in just showing up.
Yeah.
And yeah. I don't know if I'm doing it perfectly. I don't know, but I'm showing up, and I think that God has a lot of grace for those of us that are trying.
So are you seeing it translate to I think the thing I forgot to say in the content was this idea of welcoming prayer, which is centering prayer in the moment. There's a question that deals with that. Are you seeing evidence of that trickle in then to your everyday?
I've seen it. It's funny because I kind of stopped doing it over the break, and so I'm getting back into it after having done it for every day for a couple months. And I noticed it, especially this week on Wednesday. I did not do it, and I noticed my whole afternoon was just checking my phone, checking the news, and so I thought, I really need to get back into this because when I am doing it consistently, it's for me, you always have this space to return to throughout your day. That's how I think of it. I've created this 20 minutes, I'm building this space, and I always have the option to go back and feel God's presence within that throughout my day.
You were comparing this week. I'm going to get you thrown right into the heretic bin, but you were comparing it this week to yoga.
Oh, totally.
That was a helpful metaphor for me. Will you share that?
Yeah, so if you practice yoga, you'll know at the end of your time, you kind of, it's called shavasana, so you have a final resting pose, and you kind of, you've set your intention for your practice, and what do you want to take away, and so you spend 10 minutes, thinking about your space and what you want to take away. And so the language was really familiar to me. I had one instructor that said, you can always return to this space whenever you need it. And so that's how I think about centering prayer. I can always return to this space where I'm so aware of God's presence, and I lose it instantly when I get up, but you always have the option to kind of return to that. Now I just made myself sound really
No, yeah. There's so many good questions. Are you supposed to try and think about nothing, or do you need a word, image, etc.?
So my word is spirit. So that's the word I kind of focus on. And then I also have the image of the river and kayakers.
Yeah.
I need that.
Yeah,
I don't know if that changes. I'm only 4 months in, so.
Yeah, my understanding of the point of the word is it gives you a place, like, it's like technically that's a strike, or technically that's a made basket. Like when you're thinking about that, then if you're not surrendering, but you're focused on that word, then you're doing it right, is the way I understand it. Like it's giving your mind something to anchor to
Sure.
when you're operating out of your consciousness, which I know gets very weird, but the goal is to get into your subconscious or welcome God into it. But the extent that you are conscious, you're conscious about breathe, or what did you say your word is?
Spirit.
Spirit, yeah. You spell yours right?
I do.
Sweet. You capitalize it?
No, it's all capital. Well,
Really?
Yeah, in my head.
Isn't that funny how you visualize it though?
Yeah,
Like I'll catch myself like walking in circles around B, and then it's just weird how visual all our minds are. Okay, last question. And yeah, so how do you choose your word?
That's a good question. For me, I just tried. I didn't pick it before I did it the first time. I just tried it, and that was just the word that kind of kept naturally going to.
Yeah.
So it was more of I seem to focus well when I think of this word. And I think it took like a week. And then after about a week of practicing, I thought, this is the word.
Okay. I think Bourgeot says, and this was new when I reread that book, I think she talks about it doesn't matter, but ideally it has 2 syllables or less, which I thought was interesting. I think when Lynn was here, she used Yahweh. I've heard people use Abba. Like I said, there's one guy who uses an icon of Christ. So, okay, thank you.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.